The Supreme Court chamber had never felt this tense. Rows of mahogany benches gleamed under the dome's soft light, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but if they had been, every frame would have captured the gravity of the moment, the quiet before history shifted. At the council's table stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a figure of poise and restraint. Her black suit was simple, deliberate. Her notes lay neatly stacked beside a closed leather portfolio. Every movement carried intention. She had come not merely to argue a case, but to defend a principle that reached to the very heart of American democracy, the right to vote. At the far end of the bench, Justice Samuel Alito leaned back slightly, adjusting his glasses with a gesture that blended impatience and authority. He had interrupted her twice already, a record, even for him. Known in legal circles as the court's most outspoken conservative, Alito had lately become something else entirely. A symbol of a judiciary whose boundaries were being tested by ideology. The case before the court, Jefferson County versus United States, had become a national flashpoint. On paper, it was about a state's right to require certain forms of voter identification. But to those who understood the deeper implications, it was about something much larger. Whether the Constitution's promise of equality could survive the slow erosion of access to the ballot box. As Crockett began her argument, a hush fell across the marble chamber. "Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," her voice was clear and unhurried, each word landing with practiced precision. "The right to vote is not merely a procedural privilege. It is the foundation upon which all our other constitutional rights rest." Her cadence was steady, the rhythm of someone who knew the weight of every syllable. Behind her, journalists scribbled notes. In the public gallery, civil rights leaders and law students leaned forward, their attention absolute. She continued, laying out the numbers. 53,000 eligible voters turned away in Jefferson County under the state's new law. Entire precincts where polling places had been consolidated or shuttered. Disparities that weren't accidents but patterns. The kind of statistical shadows that history had cast too many times before. Article 1, Section 4 grants states the power to regulate the times, places, and manner of elections, she said. But that power is not without limit. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and 15th, were written precisely to constrain it. Justice Alito's voice sliced through the chamber. "Congresswoman Crockett, that's not what the Constitution says." The interruption echoed like a slap across still water. A few heads turned toward the press benches. Everyone knew what this was. A test, both of her argument and of her composure. Crockett looked up from her notes, eyes steady. "With respect, Justice Alito," she replied, "it says exactly that, if one reads the entire Constitution, and not merely the parts written before the nation's rebirth in Reconstruction." A murmur rippled through the audience. Alito's jaw tightened. The Chief Justice glanced sideways, silently urging restraint. But restraint wasn't Alito's strength. "You're suggesting that Article 1 no longer gives states primary control over election procedures," he pressed, his tone incredulous. "That's a rather radical reading of constitutional design." Crockett didn't flinch. "Not radical, Your Honor. Historical. The Reconstruction Amendments were not footnotes to the Founders' text. They were corrections to it, made with blood and with purpose." That single line changed the air in the room. Her tone wasn't combative, but resolute, the measured confidence of someone standing on the shoulders of generations. She pressed on, citing case law and constitutional commentary, weaving the argument together like strands of silk. She quoted the Anderson Burdick standard, that even absent explicit discrimination, any regulation imposing a severe burden on the right to vote must face heightened scrutiny. Her words struck a careful balance between law and morality, doctrine and history. Alito cut in again. "These are merely inconveniences, counsel, not constitutional violations. Every election regulation imposes some burden." It was his third interruption in 5 minutes. The rhythm of old power asserting itself. The dismissiveness of authority accustomed to being the last word. Crockett's hand hovered above her notes for a moment. Then she looked up, directly at him. Her gaze was steady, her voice lower now, deliberate. The Constitution, she said, is not merely about allocating authority. It's about constraining it. The words carried through the chamber like a slow roll of thunder. Then she paused, unfastened the clasp on her leather portfolio, and drew out a single weathered document, parchment-colored, worn at the edges. A collective lean rippled through the gallery. Reporters stopped writing. Every eye turned toward the paper in her hand. "I believe the historical record merits closer examination," she said. 4 months she had prepared for this moment, not just through legal precedent, but through original documents from the Reconstruction Congress, the very debates that birthed the 15th Amendment. The same amendment Justice Allo had referenced repeatedly in speeches as justification for broad state authority. Her voice deepened, the confidence of a scholar stepping into uncharted light. "This," she said, raising the document slightly, "is from the 1869 congressional debate over the 15th Amendment. Senator Oliver Morton, principal architect of the amendment, stated, and I quote, 'The purpose of this measure is to place the power of protecting the right to vote in the hands of the federal government, where it rightfully belongs. The states have shown themselves unworthy of this trust.'" The courtroom froze. Justice Allo shifted in his chair. The Chief Justice looked down, expression unreadable. Crockett went on. Representative James Garfield, later president, said that the time had come to establish a constitutional principle that would override all state regulations that burden the exercise of the franchise on account of conditions not inherent to the act of voting itself. Her words fell like hammer strikes. Each quotation was a nail driven into the coffin of complacent interpretation. Then, quietly but firmly, she added, and Senator William Stewart, who drafted much of the amendment's language, declared that the right to vote must be practically accessible to all citizens, regardless of station. The Chief Justice leaned forward. Justice Kagan's pen froze mid-note. Even Justice Barrett, normally reserved, nodded faintly. "These," Crockett continued, "are not obscure commentaries. They are the voices of the framers themselves, the very authors of the constitutional provisions my learned colleague cites. Their intent is unmistakable." She handed copies to the clerk, who distributed them to the justices. The rustle of paper filled the silence. Allo leaned toward his microphone, his voice slightly strained. "These are interesting historical footnotes, counsel, but—" "Not footnotes," Crockett interjected softly. "Foundations." The word landed like a verdict. She stepped back for a moment, allowing the silence to breathe. In that pause, every person in the room could sense it. The shift. The balance of authority tilting, not in power, but in truth. Behind her, a young law student whispered to a friend, "She just changed the conversation." Crockett continued, connecting the historical record to modern data. "In Jefferson County," she explained, 83% of the voters turned away under the new ID law were minorities, though they made up only 34% of the county's population. A pattern too precise to be random, too familiar to be ignored. "These disparities are not inconveniences," she said. "They are the echoes of the very injustices the Reconstruction Amendments were written to extinguish." She drew a breath. To read Article 1 as though those amendments never existed is not textualism. It's selective constitutionalism. A ripple of recognition passed through the gallery. Justice Thomas raised his eyebrows slightly, a rare gesture of acknowledgement. Chief Justice Roberts's gavel didn't move. Instead, he leaned toward the clerk and quietly extended her argument time. 5 additional minutes, a privilege almost never granted. Crockett concluded with quiet gravity. "The question before this court is not whether voting is convenient. It is whether the Constitution we all serve still protects those for whom the right to vote is most fragile." Then she closed the portfolio, her hands steady. "The framers of the 15th Amendment would recognize exactly what is happening in Jefferson County today," she said. The question is whether we have the constitutional courage to see it as clearly as they did. The chamber fell utterly silent. Justice Allo said nothing. Even the shuffle of papers seemed sacrilegious. The air held the weight of something irreversible, a truth spoken plainly in a place unaccustomed to such clarity. When she returned to her seat, no one dared whisper. No one dared move. It was, for the first time in years, a moment when the nation's highest court seemed to remember that the Constitution is not a relic, it is a living promise. Outside, on the steps of the Supreme Court, the crowd waited, unaware that history had just turned inside those marble walls. When Jasmine Crockett left the Supreme Court building that gray morning, the marble steps looked like a mountain she'd just climbed. Cameras flashed, questions flew from every direction, but she didn't stop. Her aides flanked her on either side as reporters shouted her name, their voices blending into a chorus of disbelief and urgency. Congresswoman, did you anticipate Justice Allo's reaction? Were those historical documents authentic copies? What do you think this means for the future of the case? She didn't answer any of them. Not yet. The time for talking would come later. For now, she walked down those steps with the kind of quiet resolve that follows a storm. Behind her, the white pillars of the Supreme Court gleamed like sentinels, ancient and unmoved. But inside that courtroom, something had shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably. The silence that followed her argument wasn't just respect. It was reckoning. The first ripples. By the time Crockett's car crossed the Potomac into downtown D.C., the story had already detonated across every news network. Breaking. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stuns Supreme Court with historic argument. Selective constitutionalism. The line that silenced the court. Originalist justice confronted with original sources. CNN replayed her final line. The question is whether we have the constitutional courage to see it as clearly as they did. Over a slow zoom on her face, the marble backdrop lending the image the feel of a political painting. MSNBC called it a generational moment. Even Fox News, typically hostile to her politics, acknowledged the courtroom exchange as a striking display of composure and command. But in legal circles, the reaction wasn't just admiration, it was alarm. Within hours, a network of law professors, journalists, and judicial commentators began dissecting her citations. Social media lit up with images of the 1869 congressional record pages she had read aloud. Historians confirmed the quotes as authentic. Constitutional scholars began debating their implications on podcasts, on Substack, in late-night TV panels. And somewhere inside the marble halls of the Supreme Court, aides and law clerks whispered to each other about what they had just witnessed. Justice Elena Kagan reportedly told her clerk, she didn't just win the argument, she rewrote it. Justice Barrett, according to an overheard exchange, described Crockett's performance as disciplined and devastating. Even Justice Thomas, rarely prone to public comment, was said to have nodded in acknowledgement as Crockett left the chamber. But the most dramatic reaction came from within Justice Allo's own chambers. The unraveling of a justice. 4 years, Samuel Allo had been untouchable, a lion of conservative jurisprudence, adored by some, feared by many. But since the Federalist Society speech he'd given 3 weeks prior, the ground beneath him had begun to tremble. That speech, where he had said that modern attempts to characterize basic security measures as discrimination would have puzzled the framers, had seemed, at the time, like just another salvo in the culture wars. But after Crockett's argument, it looked different. It looked like evidence. By evening, #selective constitutionalism was trending on X, TikTok, and YouTube. A clip of her saying the phrase was cut into montages of historical imagery. Marchers crossing Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge, Martin Luther King at the Lincoln Memorial, and black and white photos of the Reconstruction Congress she had quoted from. On the Rachel Maddow show, a guest historian remarked, Congresswoman Crockett didn't just challenge Justice Allo. She showed the nation that history itself was on trial. Inside the Supreme Court, clerks began fielding quiet but frantic calls from reporters seeking comment about Allo's ethics complaints, those same unresolved filings that had accumulated for months. The justice had been under scrutiny for attending donor-funded political events and for appearing to express opinions about ongoing cases. None had gone anywhere, because the Supreme Court, unlike every other court in the country, had no binding ethics code. Until now, the issue had seemed abstract. After Crockett's confrontation, it felt immediate. By Wednesday morning, a front-page headline in the Washington Post read, "Did Justice Allo cross the line? Court ethics under fire after Crockett showdown." Even conservative editorial boards began to take notice. The Wall Street Journal ran a cautious op-ed titled, "Originalism Meets Its Own History." It asked, with thinly veiled irony, whether the justice's interpretation of the Constitution could survive the very originalist scrutiny he had once championed. A Congresswoman's discipline. Back in her D.C. townhouse, Jasmine Crockett sat by a low-burning fire, laptop open, phone buzzing every few seconds. Her staff had set up a temporary press office to handle interview requests. The New York Times, PBS, NPR, The Atlantic, The Guardian. She turned them all down. Not because she feared the spotlight, she had faced worse in her years as a public defender, but because she understood timing. Public arguments are won in court. Historical ones are won in patience. Instead, she called her former mentor, Professor Charles Gaines, a constitutional scholar at Howard University who had guided her through her first civil rights case years earlier. "You did what few people ever do in that chamber," Gaines said softly. "You reminded them that the Constitution didn't end in 1787. Crockett smiled faintly. "They act like the Reconstruction amendments were annotations, not amendments." "They're going to come after you now," Gaines warned. "Be ready. When you expose power, it always fights to reassert itself." "I know," she said, "but this time, it'll have to do it in the light." Outside, the night thickened. Across the river, the Supreme Court dome gleamed under the floodlights like a monument to contradictions, both the promise of justice and the limits of those who dispense it. Inside the machine. 2 days later, behind closed doors, the justices met in conference to discuss the week's cases. By tradition, no clerks were allowed in. No recordings existed. What was said in that oak-paneled room stayed there forever. But rumors have a way of leaking through cracks in marble. According to several sources later interviewed by The New Yorker, the discussion about Jefferson County versus United States had been unusually tense. Chief Justice Roberts opened by commending Crockett's depth of preparation and historical grounding. Justice Kagan agreed, calling the record she introduced the clearest articulation of the Reconstruction framers' intent this court has ever seen. Allo reportedly frowned throughout. When his turn came, he said little, except to insist that the Constitution structure must remain intact. But even his tone, subdued, reflective, was different from his usual certainty. Later that night, in his private chambers, Justice Allo sat alone reading a printed transcript of Crockett's argument. The margins were covered in his own notes, counterpoints, citations, annotations. But his pen had stopped moving halfway through the page where she quoted Senator Morton. He had built his career on the belief that the Constitution's meaning was fixed. But here, in the words of those long-dead framers, he saw something he had never fully considered, that the Constitution had been amended not just in text, but in purpose. He closed the folder slowly, exhaling through his nose. For the first time in years, Samuel Allo wasn't certain. The country reacts. Across America, the Crockett argument became a cultural event. In classrooms, civics teachers played audio reenactments of her statement. Law students at Harvard, Howard, and Stanford debated whether her selective constitutionalism phrase marked a new era of interpretive philosophy. Civil rights organizations flooded social media with her quotes printed over images of the 15th Amendment. A TikTok remix of her line, "It's not textualism. It's selective constitutionalism," set to an orchestral soundtrack hit 4 million views in 24 hours. For a generation raised to see courts as distant and untouchable, Crockett had made constitutional law feel urgent again, alive, human, and winnable. Meanwhile, in Congress, whispers began to spread about the court's credibility. A small bipartisan group of lawmakers quietly drafted a proposal to establish an enforceable code of ethics for Supreme Court justices, something no one had dared push seriously in decades. When asked about it by a reporter, Crockett simply replied, "Transparency is not a threat to justice. It's a condition of it." The calm before judgment. 3 months passed before the court was ready to announce its decision. During that time, the nation's attention ebbed and surged, but inside legal circles, anticipation built like pressure in a sealed chamber. By late spring, the justices' deliberations had grown heated. Rumors suggested that the Chief Justice was drafting an opinion that would fundamentally reshape the court's approach to voting rights, but only if he could secure a majority. Crockett, meanwhile, returned to her legislative duties, rarely speaking about the case in public. When reporters cornered her outside the Capitol, she deflected with practiced grace. "The argument is over," she'd say. "The law will speak for itself." But privately, she understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about Jefferson County or voter ID laws. It was about how America remembered its own constitutional journey, whether the country would finally acknowledge that freedom was not a finished product but a project still underway. And deep within the Supreme Court, under the frescoed ceiling where the words "equal justice under law" glimmered in stone, the justices prepared to decide not only a case, but a legacy. The morning the Supreme Court announced its decision, Washington felt suspended in a peculiar kind of stillness. Rain fell in a thin, silver curtain over Constitution Avenue, blurring the view of the marble steps. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, lenses fogging, waiting. Inside the building, the justices filed in silently, their black robes catching faint reflections of the overhead chandeliers. It was Friday, 10 a.m., the traditional hour when the nation's most powerful court spoke to history. On the docket, Jefferson County versus United States. The case that had started as a quiet challenge over voter ID laws had become a national referendum on the meaning of equality itself. And though Jasmine Crockett was not one of the justices seated before the bench, her presence was everywhere. In the press gallery, in the whispering audience, in the expectant silence that filled the chamber like a held breath. The reading of judgment. Chief Justice Roberts adjusted his glasses, looked down at the sheaf of pages before him, and began to read. His tone was measured, deliberate, but beneath that polished calm, the room sensed gravity. "In the case of Jefferson County versus United States," he said, "we are called to determine not only the constitutional validity of certain electoral practices, but the fidelity of this court to the text and spirit of the Reconstruction Amendments." He paused. The word fidelity hung in the air. "For over a century," Roberts continued, "this court has navigated the difficult intersection between federal protection and state autonomy. But to insist that the Constitution's meaning was frozen in 1787 is to ignore that its most transformative amendments were born from the ashes of war and the moral demand for inclusion." At that, Justice Samuel Alito shifted slightly in his chair. His face remained expressionless, but his hands folded tighter. Roberts went on. "The 14th and 15th Amendments did not merely add to the Constitution. They redefined its soul. Their framers made explicit what the original document had left unsaid, that liberty without equality is a contradiction in terms." The reporters in the back began to type faster. The argument presented before this court by Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas reminded us of that truth. She invoked not only the constitutional text but the debates of those who authored it. This court finds her historical citations to be accurate, her reasoning sound, and her warning against selective constitutionalism to be a necessary one. There it was. The line that would be quoted in every newspaper, law journal, and civics textbook for decades. Selective constitutionalism is no constitutionalism at all. With those words, Roberts announced that the court, by a 6-3 majority, upheld the federal government's challenge, striking down the restrictive law as unconstitutional. Crockett had not only won, She had changed the conversation about what the Constitution meant, and who it was meant for. The dissent. When Roberts finished, Justice Allo requested to read his dissent aloud. The room shifted, journalists leaning forward, attorneys tightening their grip on pens. Allo's voice, normally firm and commanding, carried an edge of weariness. "With respect to my colleagues, I must dissent," he began. "The court today elevates the sentiments of post-bellum legislators over the structural principles enshrined by the founders. While I do not dispute the moral power of Representative Crockett's presentation, the Constitution is not a vessel for sentiment. It is a framework of governance." He paused, glancing briefly at the press gallery. "It is the duty of this court to interpret that framework, not to rewrite it." A subtle tremor ran through his voice, just enough for those close enough to notice. He finished reading 15 minutes later, his words sharp but hollow, as if spoken less from conviction and more from habit. As the justices rose, the audience remained frozen. Crockett, seated near the back, looked down briefly, not in triumph but in reflection. For her, this was never about personal victory. It was about proof that the Constitution could still expand to meet the people it had once excluded. The world reacts. By noon, the decision had swept through Washington like wildfire. NBC News. Supreme Court affirms federal authority in landmark voting rights decision. New York Times. Selective constitutionalism, rebuked by court in 6-3 ruling. The Atlantic. The Crockett Brief. How one Congresswoman rewrote the language of constitutional law. On the steps of the Supreme Court, supporters gathered with umbrellas raised high like banners. Civil rights activists embraced, their cheers echoing across the plaza. In her home district in Dallas, church bells rang. At historically black colleges across the South, professors halted classes to discuss the decision in real time. Social media exploded again. Hashtag Crockett Brief, hashtag Selective Constitutionalism, hashtag History Argues Back. Clips of Roberts quoting her argument were set to cinematic music. A still image of her standing before the bench, calm, poised, unflinching, became an instant symbol. Yet in the midst of celebration, Crockett herself stayed out of the spotlight. She released only one statement, short and restrained. "The Constitution has always contained both our failures and our redemptions. Today, we remembered the latter." Behind closed doors. Inside the Supreme Court, the decision left aftershocks. Some clerks described the ruling as the Roberts Courts Brown versus Board moment. Others saw it as a quiet civil war, a realignment that could fracture the court for years to come. Justice Kagan, who had joined the majority, reportedly told a colleague, "It took a congresswoman to remind us what the 14th Amendment actually says." Justice Sotomayor called Crockett privately that afternoon. Her message was brief. "You brought history into the room. That's what they can never undo." Even Justice Barrett, who had sided with Roberts, acknowledged the gravity of the moment. "History caught up with us today," she said to an aide. As for Justice Allo, he returned to his chambers in silence. Later that week, he canceled a speaking engagement at the Federalist Society and requested an extended leave of absence for personal reflection. The press, of course, interpreted that as resignation. It wasn't, not yet, but the aura of invincibility around him had cracked. The law schools. Within days, law schools across America began reshaping their curricula. At Yale, Harvard, and Howard, new seminars appeared: The Crockett Doctrine, History and Constitutional Interpretation. Professors debated whether Crockett's method, grounding modern arguments in original Reconstruction sources, represented a new interpretive philosophy, a kind of progressive originalism that reclaimed history from those who had weaponized it. Some scholars resisted the idea. "This isn't originalism," one wrote in the Federalist Review. "It's historical activism dressed as scholarship." But others saw in it the birth of something larger. "For the first time in decades," argued the Yale Law Journal, "the Constitution feels alive again, not because we rewrote it, but because we finally read all of it." the speech that sealed it. 2 weeks later, Crockett stood before a packed audience at Howard University's Crampton Auditorium. Students lined the walls. Cameras streamed live to millions online. She didn't use a teleprompter, just a worn folder filled with annotated notes. "When I walked into that courtroom," she began, "I didn't bring power with me. I brought memory. The memory of those who wrote the laws, those who were denied them, and those who still fight to make them real." The crowd was silent, leaning into her words. "They tell us the Constitution is sacred," she said. "But what makes it sacred is not that it is perfect, it's that we still believe it can be perfected." She lifted her eyes from the page. "The Reconstruction Congress wrote equality into our national DNA. The question is whether we will let anyone edit it out." The hall erupted. Students rose to their feet, clapping until the sound became thunder. From that night forward, the term Crockett Brief no longer referred just to her argument. It referred to a philosophy, a framework, a reminder that justice could still be argued into existence. The long reverberation. Over the next month, state legislatures began revisiting their election laws, wary of being the next Jefferson County. Congressional hearings on Supreme Court ethics resumed with new urgency. The court's public approval rating, which had been falling for years, began to recover slightly. Not because the public trusted it more, but because they had seen it humbled. And yet, beneath the surface, a countercurrent formed. Conservative media framed the decision as judicial overreach. Activist groups vowed to restore original constitutional balance. The next political battle was already forming. Crockett knew it. She'd spent her life understanding how every victory comes wrapped in the next fight. So when a journalist asked if she believed the decision had finally settled the issue of voting rights, she just smiled. "History doesn't settle," she said. "It circles back, and asks if we still mean what we said." The victory lasted exactly 72 hours before the knives came out. At first, it was subtle, op-eds questioning her motives, headlines crafted with careful cynicism. Was Crockett's courtroom triumph a political stunt? A Star is Born, or a constitutionalist in costume? Cable networks, desperate for conflict, split the story down the middle. On one side, civil rights advocates called her a national hero. On the other, pundits warned that she had politicized the court and manipulated the media. By Monday morning, her staff had stopped counting the requests for comment. The smear machine. In Washington, praise never comes without price. Anonymous leaks began appearing in conservative blogs, claims that Crockett had received unusual access to certain legal archives, that her historical documents had been selectively edited, that her research had been assisted by partisan staff. None of it was true, but truth rarely matters when narrative is cheaper. Soon, a clip surfaced on social media, taken out of context from a campaign event years earlier, where she had criticized a Supreme Court trapped in its own mythology. The clip spread with captions like, "Crockett admits bias against the court." Within days, right-wing super PACs launched ads portraying her as a radical who wanted to rewrite the Constitution. The campaign was coordinated. It wasn't about disproving her, it was about discrediting her, to make her name synonymous with audacity, not accuracy. And for a while, it worked. Cable panels filled with commentators saying things like, "She's smart but reckless, ambitious but dangerous, a showboat in the courtroom." Every compliment carried a knife hidden in the applause. The threats. Then came the messages. Hundreds of them. Emails, voicemails, letters with no return address. "Go back to Texas and stay there. You embarrassed the court. You'll regret it. We know where your office is." Her security detail doubled. Staffers began entering through a side entrance. Even so, Crockett refused to flinch publicly. When a reporter asked whether she feared retaliation, she replied, "Fear is what silence feeds on. I've been shouted down before. I didn't come this far to whisper now." Still, the strain was visible. At night, Her phone lit up with texts from her closest friends. "You okay? Need to talk?" She often replied with the same line, "I'm fine. This is the cost of the truth." But some nights, sitting by her window overlooking the Capitol dome, she felt the exhaustion settle deep in her bones. Not the fatigue of fighting, but the loneliness that comes after winning something too big to celebrate. The Senate hearings. A month later, the backlash found its institutional form. The Senate Judiciary Committee, led by a bloc of conservative senators, announced a series of hearings to examine the politicization of the Supreme Court and external influence in recent cases. Everyone knew what it meant. They were coming for her. The first hearing was televised. Crockett sat at the witness table, expression calm, posture straight, a single folder before her labeled "Record." Senator Mark Thorne, the chair, opened with an unmistakable smirk. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "some have suggested your appearance before the court was less about legal principle and more about political theater. How do you respond to that characterization?" Crockett leaned toward the microphone. "By reminding you that the Constitution doesn't belong to the Supreme Court, or to me. It belongs to the people. And sometimes the people need to see it defended in public." A murmur rippled through the room. Thorne pressed on. "And yet, you cited obscure records from 1869. Isn't it true that no sitting justice or scholar had verified those documents before your argument?" She opened the folder, sliding out several photocopied pages. "These records were verified by the Congressional Library in 2018, Senator. They've been ignored, not unseen." The room went silent again. Cameras zoomed in as she held up the page. The original transcript of Senator Morton's Reconstruction speech, the one that had turned the case. "For the record," she said, "truth doesn't need permission to be rediscovered." The next morning, every network carried the clip. The public saw the contrast clearly, her discipline versus their theater. The attack dogs. Still, the smear campaign didn't stop. Dark money groups funded documentaries with titles like The Crockett Illusion. Columnists suggested she had exploited identity politics to intimidate the justices. One commentator on a major network sneered, "She's not Thurgood Marshall. She's TikTok Marshall." But in trying to reduce her, they amplified her. Each insult added oxygen to her legend. Clips of her calm defiance before the Senate went viral. College students began tagging posts with hashtag "Truth doesn't need permission." And yet, beneath the public noise, Crockett's inner circle worried. Her chief of staff, Marissa Young, told her bluntly one night, "They're not just trying to tarnish you, they're trying to exhaust you." Crockett nodded. "Then I'll rest when they do." Marissa sighed. "You can't win every battle with willpower." Crockett looked up. "History doesn't give you a choice." The personal toll. The pressure began to take shape in smaller ways. Friends she'd known for years stopped returning calls, afraid of being pulled into controversy. A university rescinded a planned honorary degree for optics. Her own party grew cautious, urging her to de-escalate the rhetoric. At home, she slept less, ate less, smiled less. The lines under her eyes deepened, not from age, but from vigilance. And yet, every time she thought about stepping back, she remembered the faces of the voters who'd written her letters. The veterans denied ballots for missing paperwork, the grandmothers who'd stood in 6-hour lines to vote. She thought of her own mother who'd once told her, "If your voice shakes, let it, just don't let it stop." So she didn't. The leak. Then came the leak that changed everything. A conservative newspaper published a story claiming to have obtained internal Supreme Court communications, suggesting that certain justices had been pressured by public reaction to the Crockett argument. The implication, that the court's majority opinion, the Crockett decision as it was now known, had been politically influenced. Though the documents were unverified, the story exploded. Networks ran wall-to-wall coverage, questioning whether the integrity of the court had been compromised. Justice Allo seized the opportunity, issuing a rare public statement. The judiciary must not bend to political passion, however eloquently expressed. It was a veiled jab, and everyone knew it. Crockett responded only once, at a press conference outside the Capitol. If truth becomes a political passion, maybe that tells us who's afraid of it. The moment went viral. Again, allies emerge. Amid the storm, unexpected allies appeared. A coalition of constitutional scholars, including conservatives, signed an open letter defending Crockett's research as methodologically sound and historically vital. A group of retired judges wrote in the Washington Post. Her argument reminded the court that justice requires memory. We forget at our peril. Even Chief Justice Roberts, in a rare public comment, told an interviewer, the court benefits when advocates bring depth and integrity. Representative Crockett did both. It was subtle, but it was enough to shift the public tone again. The turning point. 6 months after the ruling, Crockett stood once more before the press, this time not as a witness, but as a legislator unveiling a new bill, the Judicial Ethics and Transparency Act. Her voice was calm, almost weary, but steady. For too long, she said, we've expected trust from an institution that's exempt from it. This bill doesn't attack the court. It defends its credibility. The proposal called for mandatory financial disclosures, recusal rules, and an independent ethics review panel for Supreme Court justices. Predictably, the backlash reignited. But now the tide had turned. The public had seen too much. Polls showed broad support for reform. Editorial boards that once hedged now endorsed her plan. And when asked if she feared political consequences, she smiled faintly and said, "History's the only re-election I'm running for." The quiet after the storm. Late one evening, months later, Crockett finally walked the nearly empty halls of the Capitol alone. The fight had consumed almost a year. In her office, stacks of letters from around the country filled 2 cardboard boxes. She sat down, opened one, and pulled out a note from a high school civics teacher in Georgia. My students thought the Constitution was written for someone else. After your case, they started reading it for themselves. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her desk drawer. Outside, the Capitol dome glowed faintly in the dark, the same light that had once looked so distant when she was just a public defender from Texas, fighting for clients who couldn't afford to dream this big. Now she had learned what history's light really was. Not glory, not fame, but the faint glow that stays after fire. The morning of the vote began like any other in Washington. Gray sky, the scent of rain clinging to the marble steps of the Capitol. But inside the chamber, the air carried something heavier than humidity. 4 weeks, pundits had called it Crockett's last stand. The Judicial Ethics and Transparency Act, her bill to create a binding code of conduct for Supreme Court justices, was finally up for a vote. A year had passed since her legendary argument before the court, and the city still trembled with the aftershocks. Crockett arrived early, dressed in a dark navy suit, her signature leather portfolio tucked under her arm, the same one she had opened that fateful day in the Supreme Court. This time, there were no documents to reveal, only conviction to carry. The debate. The debate lasted hours. Opponents painted the bill as a political attack on judicial independence. Supporters called it a long overdue safeguard for democracy. When her turn came to speak, the chamber fell quiet. This isn't about ideology, Crockett began, her voice steady. It's about integrity. We cannot ask the American people to trust a system that exempts itself from the very accountability it demands of others. She paused, scanning the room. Faces she'd argued with, allied with, and endured. When I stood before the Supreme Court last year, I did not question its authority. I questioned its memory of what the Constitution actually promises. She raised the portfolio slightly. Today we have that same choice. We can hide behind the mythology of power, or we can honor the principles that make it legitimate. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, applause broke out. Hesitant at first, then growing. The speaker called for the vote. When the results appeared on the board, 278 in favor, 157 against, the chamber erupted. The Judicial Ethics Act had passed. Crockett exhaled, eyes closing briefly. It wasn't victory she felt. It was release. The justice's letter. 2 weeks later, a sealed envelope arrived at her congressional office. The return address, Supreme Court of the United States. Inside was a single handwritten note, on thick cream stationery. Congresswoman Crockett, I have chosen to step down from the court, effective at the end of this term. The institution must remain larger than any one man's pride or misjudgment. I owe that much, not to politics but to principle. While we may differ on interpretation, I recognize the sincerity of your argument and the integrity with which you pursued it. Perhaps, in our own ways, we have both defended the Constitution. Justice Samuel Alito. Crockett read it twice. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet understanding. Even redemption, she realized, begins with reckoning. The farewell. Justice Alito's resignation dominated headlines. Some hailed it as accountability. Others saw it as capitulation. But to most Americans, it symbolized something deeper. A rare moment when truth had pierced the armor of power. At his farewell ceremony, the Chief Justice spoke solemnly about a colleague who never stopped wrestling with the meaning of the Constitution. In the back row, unnoticed by the cameras, Crockett listened quietly. When it ended, Alito approached her. Congresswoman, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. I was wrong about you. She smiled faintly. No, Justice Alito. You were just unfinished. He nodded, a small, weary gesture, then turned away, disappearing into the crowd of robed figures and reporters. The legacy spreads. Months passed. The Crockett decision, the Ethics Act, and the cultural aftershocks began shaping a new civic reality. Law schools introduced a new elective, Reconstruction to Reconsideration, the Crockett paradigm. Professors who once dismissed her approach as emotional advocacy now described it as originalism with conscience. At Harvard, a student symposium on her argument drew hundreds. One young woman stood during the Q&A and said, "For the first time, I saw someone who looked like me change what history means." In Jefferson County, the heart of the original case, voter registration surged by 22%. Turnout in the next election broke records. Local organizers called it the Crockett effect. And in classrooms across the country, teachers began using her Supreme Court moment as a civics lesson. Not just about law, but about courage. The reflection. One evening, long after Congress had adjourned, Crockett returned to the Supreme Court steps. The plaza was empty, save for the soft hum of traffic from Constitution Avenue. She sat on the marble steps where, years earlier, she'd walked in trembling but unbroken. Now she watched the courthouse glow under the moonlight, the same building that had once been her battleground, now her proof. From her portfolio, she pulled out a folded copy of the 15th Amendment, annotated in her own handwriting. Across the top, she had once scribbled in pen, "Freedom doesn't protect itself." She smiled faintly. A security guard passing by paused and recognized her. "Evening, Congresswoman," he said. "You here for nostalgia?" She shook her head. "Just gratitude." The documentary. The following spring, PBS released a feature-length documentary titled The Constitution Rewritten, the Jasmine Crockett story. It opened with the line she had spoken that day in the Supreme Court. The Constitution is not about allocating authority. It's about constraining it to protect fundamental rights. The film chronicled not only her courtroom confrontation but the waves it set off, the reforms, the resignation, the resurgence of civic education. In one interview, Professor Akhil Amar reflected, "Crockett didn't change the Constitution. She reminded us how to read it." The final scene showed her returning to her old public defender's office in Dallas. The building was smaller than she remembered, the paint chipped, the waiting room full. She sat beside a young woman clutching a file and whispered, "Whatever they tell you, your story matters." The woman didn't recognize her. She just nodded, eyes down, nervous. Crockett smiled, remembering herself years ago, before titles, before chambers, before marble echoes. The future. 3 years later, the first black woman Chief Justice of the United States swore in under the same oath Crockett had invoked in her argument. In her acceptance speech, she said, "I stand here because a congresswoman once reminded this court that the Constitution grows with its people, not away from them." The audience stood in applause. Crockett, watching from the gallery, felt tears she hadn't expected. She had spent her career proving the Constitution was alive. Now she saw it breathing. The final line. That night, back in her office, she drafted an op-ed for The Atlantic. It would be her last public essay before retiring from Congress. She titled it, "The Courage to See Clearly." "Democracy," she wrote, "doesn't collapse when we disagree about what the Constitution means. It collapses when we stop looking for what it meant to those who believed it could become more." The Reconstruction framers saw beyond their own time. They knew that every generation would face its own Jefferson County, its own test of courage. The question is never whether the Constitution has changed. The question is whether we have. She ended with the same line that had once silenced a Supreme Court chamber. The framers of the 15th Amendment would recognize exactly what is happening today. The question is whether we have the constitutional courage to see it as clearly as they did. She set down her pen. Outside, the Capitol dome shimmered in the distance, less a monument now than a mirror, reflecting the flicker of what she had fought to preserve. For the first time in years, Jasmine Crockett allowed herself to rest. History, she realized, was not a destination. It was a conversation, one she had spoken into so powerfully that it would echo long after her voice was gone.